13.8 billion years, the universe has been hiding a secret so terrifying, so fundamentally destructive, that its very existence defies the laws of our reality. Look around you. Look at the device in your hand, the ground beneath your feet, the distant stars burning in the night sky. Everything you see, everything you have ever known, is built on a monumental statistical anomaly. We are the survivors of a cosmic war that ended before time itself even began to tick. But what if I told you that beneath the quiet border of France and Switzerland, deep underground in the cold, humming quarters of the CERN laboratory, humanity has just resurrected the losing side of that ancient war? We have not just found the ghost of the universe, we have trapped it. Welcome to the edge of the abyss. Tonight we are staring directly into the containment field of the most dangerous, expensive, and revolutionary substance ever conceived by the human mind. The recent mind-bending achievements of the Alpha experiment have sent a shockwave through the global scientific community, forcing us to confront a question that has haunted the halls of physics for over a century. Have we finally unlocked the holy grail of infinite energy, or have we simply engineered the ultimate self-destruct button for the human race? I thought the concept of a nuclear apocalypse was the most terrifying fate we could face. But the reality of what is happening right now in Geneva makes a thermonuclear warhead look like a harmless toy. For the better part of 2 decades, the concept of antimatter has lived comfortably in the realm of science fiction, serving as a convenient plot device for Hollywood blockbusters and thriller novels. You might remember it as the glowing, ticking time bomb in Dan Brown's Angels and Demons, a terrifying weapon capable of vaporizing the Vatican in a single flash of blinding light. The sheer visceral horror of that fictional narrative works beautifully because the physics behind it is absolutely terrifyingly real. When normal matter, the exact same stuff that makes up your flesh and bones, comes into contact with its antimatter twin, they do not just burn, they do not just explode. They annihilate. They erase each other from the physical universe, entirely converting 100% of their mass into pure, unadulterated energy. This is Albert Einstein's famous equation, E equals mc squared, realized to its absolute monstrous maximum potential. To put this devastating efficiency into perspective, consider the nuclear weapons that leveled cities in the 20th century. Those bombs, the most destructive forces we have ever unleashed upon ourselves, convert only a microscopic fraction of 1% of their mass into energy. They leave behind a massive amount of physical debris and toxic radioactive fallout. Antimatter leaves absolutely nothing. It is the only fuel in the cosmos that is 100% efficient. It is the ultimate dream of interstellar propulsion and the absolute nightmare of global warfare. For years, theoretical physicists would watch these cinematic depictions of antimatter batteries and smile with a polite, almost condescending amusement. They would tell you that while the mathematics of total annihilation are perfectly sound, the engineering required to actually capture and hold this volatile substance is practically impossible. They would explain that antimatter is far too violent, infinitely too rare, and blindingly too hot to ever be contained in any significant quantity. We can create it, they would say, particle by agonizing particle in our massive accelerators, but we can never truly hold it. It is like trying to catch a living lightning bolt in a fragile glass jar. The very moment you attempt to seal the lid, the jar shatters into a million pieces and the lightning is gone forever. But as we cross the threshold into the early months of 2026, those polite, dismissive smiles are rapidly vanishing from the faces of the world's brightest minds. They are being replaced by expressions of intense, focused seriousness and perhaps a quiet, lingering dread. The narrative has violently shifted. The impossible engineering barrier has been permanently shattered. The news bleeding out of the Alpha collaboration at CERN is not about the mere detection of a new fleeting particle. It is about the absolute domination and subjugation of an ancient one. The researchers have just announced a paradigm-shifting breakthrough in the laser cooling of anti-hydrogen atoms. They have achieved cooling rates a staggering 8 times faster than anything ever recorded in human history. Now that number 8 times faster might sound like a dry clinical statistic, a mere incremental bump on a laboratory spreadsheet. But in the volatile microscopic arena of quantum mechanics, this speed is the difference between trying to catch a speeding bullet with your bare hands and freezing that bullet suspended in midair. It is a monumental leap in human capability that violently rips antimatter out of the realm of fleeting curiosities and transforms it into a tangible, manipulable, and studyable material. We are no longer talking about detecting a few stray, lonely atoms that blink out of existence in a microsecond. We're talking about trapping, holding, and actively controlling a dense glowing cloud of 15,000 anti-atoms. To truly comprehend the sheer terrifying magnitude of this shift, you have to understand the absolute hostility of the substance we are dealing with here. Antimatter is not just a different type of element. It is the evil twin of reality itself. It is born behind enemy lines, surrounded on all sides by a universe that is desperately trying to kill it. For every proton in your body, there's a theoretical antiproton with the exact same mass but a negative electrical charge. For every electron spinning around a nucleus, there's a positron waiting in the dark. If you were to somehow reach out and shake hands with an exact antimatter duplicate of yourself, the energy released in that single moment of contact would be equivalent to thousands of megatons of TNT. The atmosphere would ignite, and everything within miles would be reduced to a crater of smoking glass. Because we exist in a universe utterly dominated by normal matter, the very instant an antimatter particle is born inside the collider, it is under immediate lethal threat. The stray air molecules in the vacuum chamber, the metallic walls of the containment vessel, even the ambient thermal radiation echoing from the walls of the room, every single thing is a deadly weapon aimed directly at the anti-atom. Keeping this substance alive, keeping it from touching anything at all, is the most difficult magic trick ever performed in the history of physics. Before this mind-bending breakthrough of 2026 attempting to trap antimatter was like trying to perfectly balance a needle on its microscopic tip during a violent magnitude 9 earthquake. The anti-atoms created in the violent collisions of the particle accelerators are born incredibly hot. They're moving with ferocious, uncontrollable speed and chaotic energy. To have any hope of keeping them suspended inside a magnetic trap, you have to slow them down. You have to bleed the heat out of them until they reach temperatures hovering just a whisper above absolute zero. If they are even a fraction of a degree too hot, they simply punch straight through the invisible magnetic force field and annihilate against the cold steel walls of the container. For decades, this agonizing cooling process was slow, highly inefficient, and heartbreakingly difficult. Scientists could maybe catch a dozen atoms and hold them for a single breathless second before the trap failed and the ghost vanished in a burst of gamma rays. It was nothing more than a scientific parlor trick, a fleeting proof of concept that was utterly useless for any real-world application. We are essentially trying to build a cage for a ghost, but the cage itself is made of the very substance the ghost naturally hates. The universe has spent 14 billion years trying to keep these two opposing forces completely apart. It constructed a cosmos where matter sits comfortably on the throne and antimatter is banished to the shadows of high-energy collisions. By reaching into that cosmic void, by forcefully dragging these ghosts into the blinding light, by freezing them in their tracks and suspending them in a magnetic cage, we are not just conducting a simple experiment. We are actively defying the natural order of the cosmos. We are rewriting the fundamental script of reality itself. The researchers at CERN are standing at the absolute edge of human knowledge, looking down into a microscopic abyss that holds the ultimate power of creation and destruction. They are manipulating a substance that demands absolute unwavering perfection. One minor glitch in the magnetic field, one slight fluctuation in the cryogenic cooling system, one stray atom of oxygen leaking into the vacuum, and the entire containment field instantly collapses. The ensuing annihilation would be a stark, violent reminder that we are playing with the exact same fire that forged the universe. This is the ultimate standoff between the fragile, fleeting nature of human curiosity and the cold, unforgiving laws of physics. We are mere mortals built of stardust and fragile water, attempting to chain the mirror image of the cosmos. The recent record is a loud, blaring signal that humanity is finally ready to touch the third rail of reality. But how exactly do you build a physical cage out of pure nothingness to hold a god-like element? The answer involves laser sub-zero nightmares and a trap that defies human logic. I thought holding 15,000 anti-atoms was the ultimate victory, but what happens inside that trap will completely shatter your understanding of space and time. To understand the sheer terrifying magnitude of what the scientists at CERN are actively grappling with, we must first aggressively strip away the comforting science fiction tropes and stare directly at the fundamental, unyielding architecture of our reality. When you stand in front of a mirror, you see a perfect reflection of yourself. That image looks exactly like you, it moves exactly like you, and it seamlessly mimics your every single gesture. But you know intuitively, deep down in your bones, that the reflection is not actually real. It is nothing more than a trick of the light bouncing off a cold, silvered surface. But hidden within the deep, impenetrable mathematics of the universe, there exists a reflection that is terrifyingly, undeniably real. It is not made of mere light, but of physical, undeniable substance. It possesses actual mass, it occupies real physical space, and it stubbornly obeys the rigid laws of physics just as strictly as we do. This is the dark and silent realm of antimatter. It is the absolute physical embodiment of the universe's psychotic obsession with perfect symmetry. It is a shadowy mirror universe that exists as a flawless, inverted copy of our own reality, waiting in the dark to cancel us out. At its very core, normal matter, the incredibly mundane stuff that makes up your fragile body, the oxygen you breathe, and the glowing screen you are currently looking at is entirely built from atoms. And these microscopic building blocks are constructed from even smaller subatomic particles that carry highly specific electrical charges. The proton residing heavily in the center of the nucleus carries a positive charge. The electron frantically orbiting that nucleus like a desperate trapped satellite carries a negative charge. This delicate electrical balance is the absolute glue of our existence. It allows atoms to bond together, molecules to form, and ultimately it allows biological life to miraculously emerge from the cosmic dust. But back in 1928, a brilliant physicist named Paul Dirac was staring deeply into a complex mathematical equation that described the frantic behavior of electrons, and he suddenly realized something profoundly disturbing. The math did not just work for the standard negative electron, it also worked perfectly, flawlessly for a hypothetical particle that had the exact same mass but a positive charge. It was a mathematical ghost, a chilling prediction that for every single particle of matter in existence, there must exist an equal and opposite antiparticle. This is the true horrifying definition of antimatter. It is not some exotic magical substance made of alien ingredients from another dimension. It is made of the exact same fundamental stuff as you and me, simply flipped upside down. An antiproton is just a proton with a negative charge. A positron is just an electron with a positive charge. If you could somehow manage to gather enough of these inverted antiparticles together in one place, you could theoretically build anti-atoms. You could combine a negative antiproton and a positive positron to create antihydrogen, which is exactly the dark miracle that the alpha experiment at CERN has successfully performed. If you somehow had enough of this antihydrogen, you could theoretically build anti-water. You could ignite anti-stars, form anti-planets, and perhaps even breathe life into anti-people. This brings us directly to the most deeply unsettling analogy in all of modern physics, the ancient terrifying concept of the evil twin or the doppelganger. Imagine you're walking down a quiet, deserted street at night, and you see a solitary figure walking toward you from the shadows. As they step into the light and get closer, your blood runs cold as you realize they look exactly like you. They have the exact same height, the exact same hair color, the exact same scars hidden on their body, and they possess the exact same memories in your head. To an outside observer watching from a safe distance, the two of you are completely indistinguishable. You are flawlessly identical in every single physical measurement except for one invisible detail. Your fundamental electrical charge is reversed. Now, this might sound like a completely harmless difference, a minor insignificant technicality in the complex wiring of the universe, but it absolutely dictates the single most violent, unforgiving rule in all of nature. In the old whispered folklore of doppelgangers, seeing your exact double is a dark omen of impending death. In the cold, hard physics of antimatter, physically touching your double is an absolute guarantee of total instantaneous annihilation. I used to think the vacuum of empty space was the most harmless, empty thing imaginable. But inside the alpha trap, a single stray molecule of everyday air is a weapon of mass destruction. The interaction between matter and antimatter is unlike any other physical collision in the entire universe. When two speeding cars violently crash into each other on a highway, metal cruelly crunches, intense heat is generated and shattered. Debris flies everywhere, but the actual mass of the cars stubbornly remains. The atoms are violently rearranged, yes, but they are absolutely not destroyed. Even in the blinding flash of a nuclear explosion like the horrifying fission bombs that instantly leveled entire cities in the 20th century, we are only converting a tiny microscopic fraction of the mass of the uranium or plutonium into explosive energy. The vast, overwhelming majority of the bomb's physical material remains left behind as a deadly cloud of radioactive fallout. Nuclear fusion, the apocalyptic process that constantly powers our sun, is slightly more efficient. But even then, it only converts about 0.7% of the available mass into radiant energy. These are undeniably violent reactions. Yes, but they are incredibly messy, highly inefficient, and frustratingly incomplete. Antimatter annihilation is entirely different. It is perfectly clean, brutally absolute, and completely total. Because the particle and the antiparticle are perfect, unyielding opposites, when they finally meet in the dark, they cancel each other out completely and utterly. It is exactly like mathematically adding a positive one and a negative one. The unavoidable result is absolute zero. But in the strict, unforgiving laws of physics, you cannot just simply have zero. The physical mass cannot simply vanish into the ether without a trace. Instead, according to Einstein's famous equation, that entire mass is converted entirely 100% into blinding, searing energy. The particle and the antiparticle completely cease to exist as physical matter. They disappear from the physical universe forever, and in their place, a devastating burst of pure, high-frequency energy is violently born. This catastrophic release usually takes the form of high-energy gamma rays, the most piercing, deeply destructive, and powerful form of radiation known to science. This is exactly why the reaction is so terrifyingly, breathtakingly efficient. It is a 100% perfect conversion rate. Every single proton and antiproton involved in the collision is instantly transformed into pure light and raw heat. There is absolutely no leftover debris, no lingering ash, no twisted scrap metal to sweep up just a sudden flash of blinding, overwhelming intensity. This absolute efficiency perfectly explains why a microscopic, almost invisible amount of antimatter is directly equal to a massive mountain of standard chemical fuel. To properly visualize this terrifying reality, just consider a simple, everyday paperclip sitting on your desk. A standard metal paperclip weighs about 1 single gram. If you were to somehow construct a paperclip out of pure condensed antimatter, an anti-paperclip, and then you carefully reached out and touched it to a normal paperclip, the resulting explosion would be absolutely catastrophic. The total annihilation of just 1 gram of antimatter with 1 gram of normal matter would instantly release energy completely equivalent to roughly 43 kilotons of TNT. That is about 3 times the destructive city-leveling power of the atomic bomb tragically dropped on Hiroshima. 2 tiny, insignificant paperclips vanishing together in a nanosecond could completely level a sprawling modern metropolis, turning towering skyscrapers into a sea of molten glass. This extreme mind-numbing energy density is exactly why antimatter is the ultimate, incredibly dangerous, double-edged sword hanging over humanity's head. It brilliantly represents the tantalizing potential for infinite, perfectly clean energy, a fuel source so incredibly potent that a few tiny milligrams could effortlessly power a massive city for weeks on end without a single drop of pollution. But simultaneously, it represents the ultimate world-ending, destructive capacity. We are holding a substance that desperately wants to erase us from existence, and we are forcing it to sit still. I always assumed the mirror universe was a bizarre mathematical concept, a theoretical playground for physicists with too much time on their hands. But the terrifying, undeniable truth is that the mirror is already real, and it might literally be inside you right now. In fact, we see this mirror world bleeding into our reality in surprisingly mundane everyday ways. When you walk into a modern hospital desperate for a diagnosis, they might use something called a positron emission tomography scanner, commonly known as a PET scan, to peer deep inside your fragile human body. That letter P stands directly for positron, the exact antimatter partner of the standard electron. When a sick patient undergoes a scan, they are literally injected with a radioactive tracer that continuously emits tiny microscopic amounts of pure antimatter directly into their bloodstream. These highly volatile positrons violently travel just a fraction of a single millimeter through the darkness of your veins before violently colliding with an ordinary electron hiding in your living tissue. In that exact microscopic moment, they completely annihilate instantly, sending out a pair of high-energy gamma rays that pierce through your skin so the massive scanner can finally detect them. We are effectively casually using tiny, highly controlled antimatter explosions happening right inside your beating heart to desperately diagnose cancer. It is a medical miracle, yes, but it is also a chilling reminder that the dark twin of our reality is always waiting just a millimeter away, ready to erase whatever it touches. However, the massive, insurmountable challenge that has relentlessly plagued brilliant scientists ever since Dirac first discovered this dark reflection is that the mirror is incredibly breathtakingly fragile. In a vast, sprawling universe, utterly dominated by normal matter, an antimatter particle is a lonely, terrified stranger, stranded in a highly hostile, alien land. It is violently born completely surrounded by its worst, most lethal enemies. A single antiproton violently created inside the belly of a massive particle accelerator has to desperately navigate a cold vacuum tube because if it accidentally grazes a single microscopic air molecule, if it brushes against a single wandering nitrogen or oxygen atom, it will instantly annihilate in a blinding flash of radiation. This is exactly why the mirror universe usually only exists for agonizingly brief microseconds. These exotic particles are violently born, they frantically travel a few pathetic inches, they violently hit something normal, and they instantly die in a microscopic flash of blinding light. They are ephemeral, tortured ghosts flickering in and out of agonizing existence long before we can even begin to study them. This inherent explosive volatility creates a profound, deeply unsettling tension in the fundamental study of modern physics. We inherently know deep down in the mathematics that the cold laws of nature treat normal matter and dark antimatter almost exactly the same. Gravity should relentlessly pull on an anti-apple just as heavily as it pulls on a real physical apple falling from a tree. Light should effortlessly bounce off a polished anti-mirror just as perfectly as it bounces off a real silvered mirror hanging in your hallway. A massive burning anti-star should theoretically shine just as blindingly brightly as our own life-giving sun. If you were to peer through a powerful telescope and look at a distant swirling galaxy made entirely of antimatter, you would not be able to tell the difference at all. It would look flawlessly, beautifully identical. The only horrifying way you would ever truly know the difference is if you bravely tried to land a fragile spaceship on one of its alien planets. The exact devastating moment. Your metal landing gear softly touched the alien surface. Your entire ship, your crew, and the landing pad would instantly vanish in a catastrophic blinding burst of lethal gamma radiation. The mere existence of this terrifying mirror capability heavily suggests that the universe possesses a deep underlying, almost obsessive symmetry. It strongly implies that for every single solitary piece of the cosmic puzzle we currently hold in our trembling hands, there's a corresponding dark piece that fits it perfectly but instantly destroys it upon physical contact. It forcefully forces us to view our own comfortable reality not as the only possible triumphant reality, but merely as one surviving half of a violent ancient duality. We are simply the positive side of a cosmic equation, blindly living in a fractured world that has somehow completely forgotten its negative destructive counterpart. And the monumental alpha experiment is essentially trying to desperately reconstruct that lost ancient half, painstakingly building it brick by brick atom by agonizing atom. By trapping this volatile antihydrogen, we are holding a fractured piece of the cosmic mirror, still enough to finally see our own terrified reflection. But understanding this definition, opposite charge, same mass, total annihilation, is absolutely crucial because it sets the apocalyptic stakes for everything that follows. When we casually talk about trapping 15,000 atoms, we are not just trapping harmless grains of sand in a plastic bucket on a sunny beach. We are trapping 15,000 tiny, highly lethal potential explosions. We are trapping a desperate substance that violently fights for its very life against the cold magnetic container that relentlessly holds it. We are holding a single glowing drop of the mirror universe in the palm of our invisible magnetic hand, fully aware that if we flinch, if the trap loses power for a millisecond, the fragile mirror shatters completely. And in the dark, unforgiving world of antimatter, a broken mirror does not just bring 7 years of bad luck. It brings an instantaneous release of blinding energy that creates a miniature searing sun right here on the surface of the Earth. To exist in this universe is to completely defy the cosmic odds. When you look down at your hand, or stare at the solid chair you are sitting on, or gaze up at the billions of stars scattered across the vast night sky, you are actually witnessing a monumental, statistically impossible error. According to the absolute strictest interpretations of the fundamental laws of physics that rigidly govern the violent birth of our entire universe, absolutely none of this should be here. The universe should theoretically be a vast, freezing cold, and completely empty expanse, entirely devoid of burning stars, rocky planets, and breathing life. It should be filled with absolutely nothing but the dim, fading hum of leftover ancient radiation. The mere fact that we are sitting here breathing oxygen and asking deep existential questions about our own origins is the single greatest, most baffling paradox in all of modern cosmology. We call this the baryon asymmetry or the matter-antimatter asymmetry, but a far more visceral, terrifying name might simply be the great cosmic mystery. We are the lucky, impossible survivors of a cosmic war that ended completely before it ever truly began. And the massive, impossibly complex experiments currently running at CERN are not just blindly looking for new tiny particles to add to a textbook. They're actively, desperately hunting for the exact reason we were somehow allowed to survive the apocalypse. The grand paradox violently begins with the very nature of cosmic creation itself. In the initial unimaginable fireball of the Big Bang, some 13.8 billion years ago, the entire universe was infinitely blisteringly hot and infinitely crushingly dense. In this primordial chaotic furnace, raw screaming energy was constantly violently converting into physical mass, and that mass was instantly turning right back into blinding energy. This is Einstein's famous equation happening everywhere all at once. However, nature stubbornly enforces a strict, unforgiving cosmic balance sheet. You absolutely cannot simply create physical matter out of thin air without paying a terrible equal cost. For every single particle of normal matter violently created in that primordial soup, every negative electron and positive proton, the universe must absolutely create an equal and dark opposite twin, an antiparticle. For every electron, there is a positron. For every proton, the antiproton. This is not a polite suggestion from the universe. It is a fundamental, unbreakable conservation law of reality. Energy must be conserved, and electrical charge must be perfectly conserved. To make a plus, you must violently make a minus. If the Big Bang was a perfectly symmetrical, flawless process, it should have produced exactly 50% normal matter and exactly 50% dark antimatter. The infant universe should have been a perfect, flawless mirror with massive equal armies of particles and antiparticles violently emerging from the blinding energy soup. As the infant universe rapidly expanded and slowly cooled, these massive opposing armies would have inevitably violently collided in the dark. And as we already thoroughly discussed, when matter meets antimatter, they instantly violently annihilate. They completely destroy each other without a trace, instantly releasing their entire mass back as screaming energy. In a perfectly, beautifully symmetrical universe, this great cosmic annihilation would have been absolutely terrifyingly total. Every single proton would have eventually found a dark antiproton. Every single electron would have tracked down a positron. They would have canceled each other out completely, leaving behind a dead universe made of pure blinding light, a massive cosmic flashbulb going off in the dark, followed instantly by eternal freezing darkness. There would be absolutely no leftover surviving atoms to slowly form swirling gas clouds, no heavy gas to violently ignite into burning stars, and certainly no complex carbon atoms to slowly evolve into breathing, thinking human beings. The cosmic equation should have absolutely summed to a perfect empty zero. Yet somehow, impossibly, we are here. When we peer out into the freezing cosmos with our massive orbiting telescopes, we clearly see billions of sprawling galaxies made entirely of normal matter. We see massive glowing gas clouds made of normal matter. We do not see vast hidden regions of antimatter lurking in the dark. If there were massive antimatter galaxies out there, the invisible boundary where they violently met our normal matter galaxies would be a blazing, blinding wall of lethal gamma radiation from the constant, never-ending annihilation of intergalactic gas. But the night sky is terrifyingly quiet. The sensitive gamma ray detectors mounted on our silent satellites only see a faint, diffuse cosmic glow, but absolutely nothing that indicates a massive ongoing war between matter and antimatter sectors of the universe. This means that somehow in those very first violently chaotic fractions of a single second after creation, the perfect balance was violently impossibly broken. The great cosmic annihilation definitely did happen, but it was not perfectly complete. Frustrated physicists estimate that for every single billion particles of dark antimatter created in the violent heat of the Big Bang, the universe somehow created exactly 1,000,000,001 particles of normal matter. It was a tiny, microscopic, almost imperceptible imbalance, a statistical fluctuation of just one single part in a billion. When the infant universe rapidly cooled and the great annihilation violently began, the billion pairs completely destroyed each other, utterly filling the expanding cosmos with the faint background radiation we can still easily detect today. But that one single incredibly lucky extra particle, the ultimate survivor, had absolutely no dark partner left to kill it. It miraculously remained. It floated completely alone in the freezing, rapidly cooling void. Over billions of years of deep time, those incredibly lonely, lucky survivors slowly clumped together under the relentless pull of gravity. They formed simple hydrogen, then slightly heavier helium. Gravity mercilessly pulled them into massive burning stars, which violently forged even heavier elements in their cores. Eventually, those dying stars exploded, scattering those heavy elements to slowly form rocky planets, and on at least one tiny blue planet, they somehow formed us. All the burning stars, all the sprawling galaxies, and every single beating atom in your fragile body are made entirely from those incredibly lucky, leftover 1 in a billion cosmic survivors. We are nothing more than the universe's mathematical rounding error, the ash that stubbornly refused to burn in the Great Fire. And this is exactly where the monumental mind-bending significance of the Alpha experiment violently comes into sharp, terrifying focus. The brilliant scientists at CERN are not just trapping freezing antihydrogen to simply prove they can do a neat engineering trick. They are trapping it to ruthlessly interrogate it. Because if normal matter and dark antimatter are truly perfectly flawless reflections of each other, then the very existence of the Big Bang and our subsequent survival makes absolutely no logical sense. Therefore, there must be a hidden flaw in the cosmic reflection. There must be some tiny, incredibly subtle, almost invisible difference between a normal hydrogen atom and an anti-hydrogen atom that somehow allowed normal matter to miraculously win the ancient war. By trapping these 15,000 atoms of anti-hydrogen and holding them perfectly unnaturally still in the dark, the scientists at CERN are effectively, literally building a microscopic time machine. They are violently recreating the exact terrifying conditions of the early universe inside a tiny magnetic bottle. They are freezing the cosmic suspect in place to take its ultimate mugshot. If the universe committed the perfect crime leaving us alive while erasing everything else, these 15,000 captured ghosts hold the only key to finding out why we were spared the apocalypse. But staring into that magnetic bottle reveals a terrifying engineering paradox. How do you build a physical container for a substance that instantly dissolves the very concept of physical matter? To truly comprehend the sheer mind-bending engineering miracle that has just taken place deep underground at CERN, one must first deeply appreciate the absolute physical paradox of the terrifying task at hand. Throughout the entire recorded history of human science, the physical container has always been just as fundamentally important as the dangerous content it holds. If a brilliant chemist discovers a highly corrosive new acid, they safely store it in a thick glass vial. If a brave engineer harvests a highly toxic deadly gas, they forcefully compress it deep inside heavy steel cylinders. If a cautious researcher isolates a violently radioactive isotope, they heavily shield it behind thick walls of solid cold lead. Every poison, every explosive, every dangerous element we have ever dragged out of the dark has always had a physical master. But dark antimatter completely and utterly defies every single conventional rule of human storage. It presents a terrifying existential problem that sounds exactly like an impossible riddle violently ripped from the pages of a dark fantasy novel. How on earth do you successfully hold a substance that instantly, violently destroys absolutely anything it physically touches? There's absolutely no physical material in the entire known expanding universe. No compressed diamond, no reinforced titanium, no hyperforged, hardened alien alloy that can safely hold even a single drop of antimatter. To a violently vibrating atom of antihydrogen, a massive wall of solid reinforced steel is not a safe barrier. It is a highly explosive minefield waiting to trigger. The exact horrifying moment the anti-atom lightly grazes the cold surface of the metallic container, it instantly encounters the billions of normal protons and electrons aggressively swarming inside the metal. The unavoidable result is instant, unimaginably violent annihilation. The metallic container does not just simply fail to gracefully hold its volatile contents. The container completely ceases to exist at the exact microscopic point of contact, and the dark contents violently vanish in a blinding, lethal burst of screaming gamma radiation. This is the ultimate terrifying universal solvent problem. In the ancient dusty books of forgotten alchemy, the universal solvent was a dark, mythical, impossible substance that could effortlessly dissolve absolutely any physical material in the world. The obsessed alchemists, furiously searching for it, somehow never stopped to ask themselves the most obvious, terrifying question. What exact type of bottle would they keep it in for it would instantly, violently dissolve the very bottle itself? Antimatter is the cold, hard, real-world equivalent of this ancient, terrifying myth. Therefore, the bottle meant to contain it cannot possibly be made of physical matter. It must be made of something entirely else. It must be woven out of intangible, invisible forces. It must be a cage constructed not of cold iron bars, but of pure humming energy and empty probability. This brings us directly to the first agonizing layer of the monumental engineering challenge, the absolute terrifying vacuum. Before the brilliant engineers at CERN can even begin to arrogantly think about successfully trapping the dark particle, they must violently clear the cosmic stage. The very air you are comfortably breathing right now into your fragile lungs is a thick, incredibly chaotic, violent soup of billions of nitrogen, oxygen, and argon atoms violently smashing into each other. To a fragile, deeply terrified antimatter particle, the invisible air in your quiet room is as incredibly dense and instantly deadly as a massive solid wall of heavy lead. If you were to accidentally release a single lonely antiproton right here, right now, it would not successfully travel more than a few pathetic microscopic centimeters before violently hitting a stray air molecule and instantly exploding into pure light. To give this dark, impossible substance even a microscopic chance to briefly survive in our hostile reality, the engineers must violently create an artificial void that aggressively rivals the freezing absolute emptiness of deep intergalactic space. The massive experimental chambers buried at the Alpha experiment are violently pumped down to an ultra-high vacuum that defies common logic. We are talking about internal pressures so unimaginably low that they are measured in fractionally tiny trillionths of a standard atmosphere. In this deeply unsettling artificial environment, a single stray gas molecule is an incredibly rare, almost impossible event. This extreme suffocating emptiness is the dark, silent canvas upon which the magnetic trap is painstakingly painted, desperately ensuring that the only physical thing that terrified antimatter has to constantly worry about is the distant cold wall of the vacuum chamber itself. But with the hostile air completely removed, humanity violently faces the second, far more insidious invisible challenge: the relentless pull of gravity and the chaotic, violent nature of thermal motion. Even in a perfect, flawless, impossibly empty vacuum, a lonely atom will inevitably fall downward due to the relentless tug of gravity, or it will frantically bounce around like a madman due to its own inherent heat energy. If it falls, or if it bounces too far, it inevitably hits the solid wall. Game over. Annihilation. To desperately stop this from happening, the scientists heavily employ the penning trap, a massive humming device that acts as the initial high-security holding cell for the raw, violently hot ingredients of antihydrogen. A penning trap is a brilliant, almost arrogant application of human electromagnetism. It uses a complex, highly tuned combination of static electric fields and a crushingly strong magnetic field to forcefully confine the charged, terrified particles. Imagine a smooth, sloping bowl. If you simply put a rolling marble inside a bowl, gravity relentlessly pulls it to the absolute bottom, and the curved sides forcefully keep it from rolling out onto the floor. A penning trap artificially creates an invisible electromagnetic bowl designed specifically for electrically charged particles. The complex physics entirely relies on the Lorentz force. When a highly charged, violently speeding particle, like an antiproton or a positron, rapidly moves through a massive magnetic field, it is forcefully, violently compelled to tightly travel in a rapid circle. It frantically spirals around the invisible magnetic field lines, completely unable to cross them. It is exactly like a tiny, desperate bead violently trapped on a taut, invisible string. The electric field then tightly caps the two extreme ends of that string, rapidly bouncing the terrified particle back and forth forever. Inside this humming, invisible trap, the dark ingredients of antimatter can be safely held, suspended directly in the dead center of the cold vacuum tube, silently levitating in a magnetic cradle, completely terrified, never ever touching the physical walls. This specific technology is relatively mature. We have been arrogantly trapping regular ions this exact way for decades. However, the alpha experiment is absolutely not just trying to simply trap the raw ingredients. It is desperately trying to trap the final terrifying product, actual antihydrogen. And right here is exactly where the engineering difficulty violently spikes vertically into the realm of absolute madness. Dark antihydrogen is violently made by perfectly mixing a negative antiproton and a positive positron. When they successfully violently combine in the dark, their opposing electrical charges instantly cancel completely out. The terrifying resulting antiatom is suddenly entirely electrically neutral. And in that exact terrifying fraction of a millisecond, the incredibly expensive penning trap completely instantly stops working. The humming electric fields suddenly have absolutely nothing to grab onto. The massive magnetic field lines can no longer violently force the neutral particle to spiral. The desperate bead suddenly falls cleanly off the invisible string. The newly formed highly volatile antihydrogen atom is suddenly completely invisible to the powerful electric cage. It is suddenly entirely free to rapidly fly in a perfectly straight line right into the freezing walls of the metallic chamber, bringing guaranteed instantaneous death. To successfully catch a completely neutral ghost, the desperate engineers have to somehow brutally exploit a much subtler, deeply hidden property of the atom, its microscopic magnetic moment. Although the newly formed antiatom currently has absolutely no net electrical charge, it violently acts exactly like a tiny subatomic bar magnet spinning in the dark. It possesses a distinct north and a distinct south pole entirely due to the frantic, chaotic spin of its internal dark particles. This means it can still vaguely, weakly interact with a massive magnetic field, but absolutely only if that specific field is artificially shaped in a very specific, incredibly complex three-dimensional way. This is known in the dark corners of physics as a minimum B-trap or an Ioffe-Pritchard trap. Imagine the invisible magnetic field not as a set of straight lines, but as a violent, deeply curved landscape. The frantic engineers use massive superconducting octopole magnets to violently create a deep magnetic bathtub right in the dead center of the freezing vacuum chamber. In this terrifying landscape, the invisible magnetic field is specifically engineered to be at its absolute weakest in the exact dead center, and it gets exponentially violently stronger as you rapidly move outward toward the metallic walls. For an antihydrogen atom with the correct frantic spin rapidly moving outward toward the crushingly strong magnetic field at the wall is exactly like trying to forcefully roll a heavy bowling ball up a completely vertical, impossibly steep hill. The massive magnetic force violently pushes the terrified atom right back toward the center, right back toward the absolute bottom of the invisible bathtub. But here's the ultimate terrifying catch. This magnetic hill is incredibly laughably shallow. The invisible force pushing the atom back is weak, incredibly weak, practically pathetic, compared to the brutal electric forces previously used in the penning trap. This brutal reality directly brings us to the agonizing decades-long struggle that has completely defined the last 20 years of antimatter research, the relentless, unwinnable war against simple temperature. In the frantic microscopic world of vibrating atoms, temperature is nothing more than a simple brutal measure of sheer physical speed. A highly hot atom is a violently fast atom. A freezing cold atom is a sluggish, slow-moving atom. When dark antihydrogen is violently forged by brutally smashing antiprotons and positrons together at high speeds, the resulting dark atoms are almost always born incredibly violently hot. They are rapidly moving with massive uncontrollable kinetic energy. The invisible magnetic bathtub artificially created by the massive alpha trap is incredibly dangerously shallow. If the terrified antihydrogen atoms are moving even slightly too fast, even if that too fast is just the incredibly slow speed of a gentle, casual human walking pace, they will possess more than enough kinetic energy to simply roll right up the invisible magnetic hill, completely breach the barrier, and instantly smash violently into the cold steel wall. It is exactly like desperately trying to safely keep a massive handful of hyperactive, terrified fleas inside a completely flat, shallow saucer. If they violently jump even a fraction of an inch, they're gone forever in a blinding flash of annihilation. For years, this horrifying reality was the agonizing tragedy of the entire alpha experiment. Brilliant, exhausted scientists would violently mix millions of screaming antiprotons and positrons in the dark, successfully creating thousands of elusive antihydrogen atoms. And out of that massive chaotic swarm of dark matter, maybe just one single impossibly lucky atom would happen to be randomly moving slowly enough to get miraculously caught in the shallow, invisible magnetic bathtub. The desperate scientists would collectively hold their breath in their freezing control room, staring blankly at the glowing monitors, praying to a universe they were trying to break that the single lonely atom would somehow stay stable. For a painfully long time, human success was pathetically measured in mere milliseconds. They would successfully trap an anti-atom for a tenth of a single agonizing second before it inevitably escaped the magnetic cage or a stray wandering gas molecule brutally killed it. It was a fleeting, heartbreaking victory. You simply cannot study a substance that violently disappears in the literal blink of an eye. You cannot measure its dark spectrum. You cannot test its gravitational pull. You can only say with absolute certainty that it was briefly here and now it is violently gone. This relentless, heartbreaking struggle is exactly what makes the magnetic bottle analogy so incredibly painfully poignant. We are absolutely not building a simple bottle out of thick glass or forged steel. We are desperately trying to build a bottle entirely out of empty probability and sheer invisible magnetic gradients. We are desperately trying to construct an invisible force field that is just strong enough to violently push back against the raw momentum of the dying atom, but precise enough not to distort the delicate measurements we desperately want to take. The invisible walls of this magnetic bottle are undeniably the most impossibly expensive walls in human history. They require endless miles of coiled superconducting wire, massive bottomless lakes of freezing liquid helium, and a terrifyingly complex control system that can rapidly adjust the magnetic fields with microsecond flawless precision. The monumental engineering challenge is quite literally a desperate, unwinnable battle against the fundamental disorder of the entire universe. Thermodynamics violently wants the atoms to be blisteringly hot. Entropy relentlessly wants the empty vacuum to be completely filled. Gravity mercilessly wants the floating atoms to fall to their doom. The exhausted engineers at CERN are actively, violently fighting all three of these ancient, fundamental forces simultaneously in the dark. They are desperately trying to carve out a tiny microscopic calm island in the middle of a violently chaotic universe, a heavily shielded sanctuary where the unforgiving laws of absolute annihilation are temporarily magically suspended. The mere fact that they could somehow trap even one single terrified atom was a monumental historic triumph of human intellect over the brutal forces of nature. But one single atom is absolutely not a revolutionary fuel source. One single atom is definitely not a city-leveling weapon. One single atom is a fleeting microscopic curiosity. To violently move from mere curiosity to actual world-changing capability, they absolutely needed to deepen the invisible bathtub. They desperately needed to violently stop the microscopic fleas from jumping to their deaths. They urgently needed to find a miraculous way to aggressively drain the heat energy out of the chaotic system vastly faster than the universe could pump it back in. This desperate burning need for absolute speed, the critical need to instantly freeze the antiatoms down before they could tragically escape violently, set the stage for the historic reality, breaking breakthrough that would finally permanently allow them to screw the heavy lid onto the magnetic bottle. The desperate decades-long struggle to safely contain the most explosive volatile substance in existence has always been a terrifying, unwinnable race against deep time and blistering temperature. But as humanity boldly enters the year 2026, the fundamental, unbreakable rules of that cosmic race have been violently, permanently rewritten. For years, the Alpha experiment at CERN was relentlessly bottlenecked by a deeply frustrating, insurmountable physical limitation. The sheer blinding speed of the anti-atoms they were violently creating. No matter how impossibly perfect the artificial vacuum was, or how crushingly strong the magnetic fields became, the newborn anti-hydrogen atoms were always born with vastly too much chaotic kinetic energy. They were simply too blisteringly hot to be effectively safely managed by human hands. But the recent earth-shattering news bleeding out from the cold laboratories marks what many terrified physicists are calling a monumental quantum leap in dark antimatter manipulation. The mind-bending breakthrough involves a completely revolutionary paradigm, shifting advancement in deep laser cooling technology that has miraculously allowed desperate scientists to violently chill antihydrogen atoms at a rate a staggering 8 times faster than anything previously achieved in all of human history. This is absolutely not just a minor incremental improvement on a spreadsheet. It is a violent, earth-shattering game-changer that completely transforms antimatter research from a desperate game of lucky random catches into a highly systematic, heavily industrialized process of dark mass production. To truly understand exactly why aggressively cooling an atom 8 times faster is so terrifyingly significant, we have to look deeply into the delicate, bizarre physics of a concentrated laser beam. In our everyday, mundane human experience, we naturally think of blinding lasers as intense sources of searing heat, powerful industrial tools used to violently cut through thick steel plates or perform highly delicate eye surgery. But in the strange inverted world of quantum atomic physics, a highly tuned laser can miraculously act exactly like a freezing fire extinguisher. When a blinding photon from a perfectly tuned laser violently strikes a terrified atom, rapidly moving directly toward it, the atom absorbs the photon and violently receives a tiny microscopic kick in the exact opposite direction. If you meticulously, flawlessly tune the specific frequency of the laser just right, a miraculous process known in physics as Doppler cooling, you can guarantee that the atom absolutely only absorbs incoming photons that are violently moving directly against its own forward motion. It is exactly like trying to desperately slow down a violently speeding, out-of-control car by relentlessly pelting its windshield with millions of tiny bouncing ping-pong balls. Each individual microscopic impact is completely negligible, but collectively, millions of them violently drain the massive car's forward momentum until it miraculously comes to a freezing absolute crawl. In the monumental 2026 Alpha upgrade, the engineering team successfully flawlessly implemented a completely new massive high repetition rate ultraviolet laser system, specifically obsessively designed to perfectly interact with the unique hidden energy transitions of dark antihydrogen. Historically, desperately trying to cool antimatter was a painfully slow and agonizingly inefficient process. Because the invisible magnetic bathtub specifically used to hold the dark atoms is so dangerously, pathetically shallow, the vast majority of the atoms would simply instantly fly completely out of the trap long before the slow lasers had enough time to gradually slow them down. The brilliant physicists were essentially desperately trying to catch an angry swarm of genetically modified killer bees with a delicate net made entirely of slow-moving light, while the bees were violently moving at supersonic lethal speeds. Almost all of them escaped into the walls before the scientists could even bring the glowing net to bear. By violently, aggressively increasing the cooling speed by a massive factor of 8, CERN has effectively permanently slammed the exit door shut in the face of the universe. The blinding lasers now violently grab the screaming anti-atoms almost the exact terrifying instant they are violently forged in the dark, aggressively draining their searing heat and forcefully settling them deep into the dead center of the trap, long before they even have a single chance to physically touch the cold metallic walls and instantly annihilate. This monumental violent leap in sheer speed has profound terrifying consequences for the absolute stability of the entire experiment. When you violently cool an explosive atom 8 times faster, you are not just simply saving time on a clock. You are radically aggressively increasing the physical density of the highly dangerous sample. In previous frustrating years, the Alpha experiment could absolutely only hope to ever hold a tiny handful of lonely atoms at any given time, because the violent hot atoms would constantly chaotically collide with and aggressively knock out the few cold stable ones. It was a deeply frustrating one and one-out cosmic scenario that kept the total survival count extremely pathetically low. With the 2026 breakthrough, the violent cooling is so incredibly brutally rapid that the screaming anti-atoms become instantly frozen completely in place long before they can violently interfere with one another. This has miraculously allowed the desperate team to aggressively begin stacking massive pulses of dark antimatter, rapidly accumulating a glowing population that is completely orders of magnitude larger than absolutely anything we have ever seen before. This is exactly the terrifying historic moment where we violently move from simply trapping a single fleeting curiosity to actively maintaining a highly stable, tightly controllable glowing cloud of the mirror universe. The quantum leap also refers entirely to the unprecedented godlike precision with which these trapped atoms can now be deeply studied. In the agonizing past, the captured atoms were still violently wiggling vastly too much due to residual heat, which completely blurred the delicate measurements of their internal dark structure. It was exactly like desperately trying to take a high-resolution, crystal-clear photograph of a terrified person who is violently, constantly shivering in the freezing cold. No matter how incredibly expensive or good your camera is, the final image will always be a fuzzy, useless blur. By successfully achieving this entirely new mind-bending level of deep, rapid cooling, the exhausted Alpha researchers have effectively forcefully told the screaming anti-atoms to stand absolutely perfectly still. This unprecedented stability flawlessly allows for deep spectroscopy measurements with a terrifying level of intricate detail that was previously nothing more than a wet theoretical dream. We can now peer directly into the beating heart of the dark anti-atom and ask if it truly vibrates at the exact flawless same frequency as regular life-giving hydrogen. If there is even a billionth of a single % difference, this new aggressive cooling technique is exactly what will finally allow us to see it. Furthermore, this violent breakthrough completely solves the terrifying problem of trap depth. Because the invisible magnetic fields desperately used to forcefully confine completely neutral antihydrogen are inherently pathetically weak, the only possible way to make the invisible trap deeper was to forcefully make the terrified atoms vastly colder. By aggressively violently reaching these new record-breaking freezing temperatures 8 times faster, the brilliant scientists have effectively made their invisible magnetic bottle an incredible 8 times more secure. The frozen atoms are now sitting so deeply safely buried in the bottom of the magnetic bathtub that they are virtually entirely immune to the minor chaotic fluctuations in the hostile environment that used to instantly cause them to violently annihilate. This unprecedented mind-bending stability is exactly what allows the massive 15,000 atom record to be physically possible. We have successfully violently moved from a fleeting microsecond of dark existence to holding a glowing cloud of antimatter for hours and eventually perhaps for days. We are actively building a permanent prison for the most dangerous criminals in the cosmos. The technical mastery required to achieve this cannot be overstated. The blinding lasers used in the Alpha experiment must be stabilized to a microscopic fraction of a single hertz and flawlessly synchronized with the violent pulsing of the massive antiproton decelerator. The timing must be absolutely terrifyingly perfect. If the laser pulse violently hits a nanosecond too late, the terrified atom is completely gone in a flash of radiation. If the exact frequency is off by a single hair, the laser violently adds searing heat instead of removing it, completely destroying the dark sample instantly. The monumental 2026 achievement is a breathtaking testament to the absolute perfection of this violent synchronization. It brilliantly represents a terrifying synergy between massive particle acceleration, freezing cryogenic engineering, and bizarre quantum optics that has never been successfully realized at this monumental scale. This rapid advancement also violently signals the absolute end of the primitive anti-proton decelerator era, as we once knew it, and the terrifying beginning of the industrialized antimatter factory era. When you can aggressively cool highly volatile particles this incredibly quickly, you can finally start thinking about massive throughput. You can seriously start thinking about physically transporting these highly explosive dark atoms to other specialized areas of the sprawling CERN complex, or even dangerously shipping them to other heavily guarded laboratories around the world. The historic 2026 record is the absolute terrifying proof of concept for the portable magnetic antimatter traps that have long been a wild staple of science fiction. If you can violently cool them fast enough and tightly hold them securely enough, the sci-fi dream of moving raw antimatter completely out of the deep basement of CERN and into the wider unsuspecting world of experimental physics becomes a highly tangible, deeply unsettling reality. Ultimately, this quantum leap is entirely about absolute control. For the very first time in human history, we are no longer just helpless victims of the incredibly volatile, explosive nature of antimatter. We have violently become its masters. We have finally found the massive brakes for the most dangerous, destructive substance in existence. And we have terrifyingly found that those brakes are 8 times more powerful than we ever dared to imagine. When we loudly speak of these recent historic triumphs at CERN, the specific number 15,000 loudly rings out with the deep resonance of a grand world-changing achievement. For the exhausted, brilliant scientists working relentlessly within the Alpha collaboration, reaching a sustained stable trap of 15,000 anti-hydrogen atoms feels exactly like finally ascending the brutal summit of a massive mountain they have been desperately climbing for decades. It is a staggering, mind-bending leap from the early primitive days of the experiment, when the terrified team wildly celebrated the fleeting capture of a single solitary anti-atom. To violently move from the singular to the thousands represents a massive fundamental change in the very nature of the highly dangerous work. We have officially transitioned from the primitive era of mere detection, where the only goal was simply to prove that an anti-atom could even exist for a few milliseconds, to the terrifying era of massive accumulation. But as we collectively marvel at this new unprecedented scale, we must also forcefully ground ourselves in a cold, unforgiving, physical reality check. The word 15,000 sounds massive, even deeply intimidating, especially when closely associated with a dark substance as violently explosive as antimatter. However, when we forcefully place that number on the massive scales of the macro world, we begin to truly understand just how incredibly far we have come and how impossibly terrifyingly far we still have to go. To the fragile human mind, 15,000 of absolutely anything feels like a massive crowd. If you had 15,000 screaming people packed in a stadium, the collective roar would be absolutely deafening. If you held 15,000 flawless diamonds in your hands, you would instantly be among the wealthiest individuals on Earth. But in the incredibly tiny, chaotic world of atomic physics, the number 15,000 is nothing more than a ghost of a whisper. To truly understand the pathetic scale, we have to brutally compare it to a single gram, the standard everyday unit of measure for a small amount of physical matter, like a single harmless paperclip. A single gram of normal hydrogen contains roughly 600 sextillion vibrating atoms. That is a massive 6 followed by 23 endless zeros. In that mind-crushing context, 15,000 is not even a single tiny drop in the bucket. It is a single isolated molecule completely lost in a vast, sprawling global ocean of darkness. If you were to somehow take all 15,000 anti-hydrogen atoms currently held tightly in the alpha trap and violently annihilate them all at once, right now the result would absolutely not be a city-leveling catastrophic explosion. In fact, it would not even be nearly enough raw energy to boil a single tiny thimble of drinking water. It would be a microscopic flash of light so incredibly faint, it would be nearly impossible to actually see with the naked human eye. This is the central, deeply frustrating paradox of modern antimatter research. We are loudly celebrating a record-breaking historic quantity that is still, for all intents and purposes, almost absolutely nothing. If you were to desperately try to collect dark antimatter at the current record-breaking rate of the massive alpha experiment, it would completely take vastly longer than the entire current age of the universe to painfully accumulate a single solitary gram. This brutal reality check is absolutely essential to forcefully debunking the immediate panicked fears of devastating antimatter bombs or unlimited magical energy batteries being rolled out to the public next year. We are absolutely not yet in the highly dangerous business of massive industrial mass production. We are still deeply stuck in the incredibly slow business of artisanal atom-by-atom craftsmanship. The 2026 record is undeniably a monumental historic achievement in the long history of precision human engineering, but it is definitely not yet a credible threat to the massive global energy market or a terrifying weapon of mass destruction. So if 15,000 tiny atoms cannot even power a small light bulb or lightly singe a building, why on earth does this specific number matter so incredibly much? Why is the global scientific community treating this tiny number exactly like a massive earth-shattering revolution? The critical answer lies entirely in the monumental shift from passive observation to highly active, aggressive experimentation. When you have only one or two terrified atoms violently bouncing around you or merely a passive, helpless observer, you blindly watch the doomed atom violently flicker into dark existence, and you desperately hope you can clearly see it before it violently dies. You are severely limited by the chaotic statistical noise of a single random event. But when you finally have 15,000 atoms held completely stable and perfectly frozen in a massive magnetic trap, you suddenly have a highly viable sample. You finally have a glowing cloud. You finally have enough dark material to actually forcefully perform real physics. This unprecedented scale beautifully allows for the very first high-precision, rigorous measurements of the dark mirror universe. With 15,000 stable atoms, scientists can violently hit the glowing sample with a high-powered laser and meticulously measure the dark response with incredible mind-bending accuracy. Because they finally have a large number of atoms, they can aggressively repeat the exact same measurement thousands of times within the exact same magnetic trap, meticulously averaging out the microscopic errors and desperately looking for the tiny subtle discrepancies that might actually exist between normal matter and dark antimatter. It is exactly the fundamental difference between desperately trying to hear a complex song through a thick brick wall with one ear and comfortably standing in the very front row of the loud concert with a highly sensitive professional microphone. 15,000 atoms finally provide the massive volume strictly necessary to actually hear the dark music of the hidden spheres. Furthermore, this unprecedented scale miraculously allows for the very first real-world tests of universal gravity on the dark sector. In a highly ambitious, deeply terrifying project known entirely as Alpha G, the brilliant team is now fully able to physically release their stable cloud of 15,000 captured atoms and simply watch exactly how they physically fall in the cold vacuum. With one single atom, you simply cannot be sure if it randomly fell heavily because of gravity or if it was just violently bumped by a stray microscopic magnetic fluctuation in the room. But with 15,000 identical atoms, you can clearly watch the entire glowing cloud move entirely as a single cohesive unit. You can meticulously measure the exact statistical distribution of their terrifying descent. This is the very first time in all of recorded human history we have finally had enough dark antimatter in one single place to ask a fundamental reality-breaking question. Does the evil twin of normal matter fall heavily down toward the Earth? Or does it terrifyingly defy gravity and fall violently up into the sky? Without the critical scale of 15,000 atoms, that terrifying question would remain purely frustratingly theoretical forever. Now it is an actual empirical world-changing measurement. This monumental achievement also loudly signals a massive breakthrough in sheer containment stability. Successfully storing 15,000 highly explosive atoms is not just about desperately catching them in the dark, it is entirely about ruthlessly keeping them. The vastly more atoms you violently pack into a confined magnetic trap, the vastly more they aggressively interact with each other in the dark. They can violently collide, chaotically exchange heat energy, and aggressively knock each other right out of the invisible magnetic bathtub to their immediate deaths. Reaching the massive 15,000 mark definitively proves that our invisible magnetic bottles are now vastly sophisticated enough to flawlessly manage a highly complex multi-body dark system. We have successfully moved way past the primitive stage of holding a single fragile marble in a smooth bowl to holding a massive swirling handful of highly explosive water. This is the absolute bedrock foundation of all future high-density antimatter storage. If we can successfully master the terrifying stability of 15,000, we can forcefully begin to rapidly design the massive traps that will eventually hold 15 million and one day an apocalyptic 15 billion. But to honestly discuss the true future of antimatter, one must eventually move completely past the awe-inspiring wonder of quantum mechanics and brutally confront the cold, hard, unforgiving mathematics of the global economic ledger. In the brutal realm of human economics, dark antimatter is absolutely not just an exotic, highly unstable state of matter. It is the ultimate, unbelievably expensive luxury item. It is a highly volatile substance so incredibly rare and so absurdly difficult to manually produce that it easily makes solid gold, flawless diamonds, and even highly enriched weapons-grade plutonium look exactly like common worthless street gravel. While the global scientific community loudly celebrates the historic capture of 15,000 atoms, the cold financial world simply looks at the massive price tag and violently shudders in terror. Official estimates for the actual production cost of raw antimatter wildly vary, but the most widely accepted terrifying figure is a staggering $62.5 trillion for a single microscopic gram. To put that completely absurd number into a realistic perspective, the entire massive annual gross domestic product of the entire planet Earth is roughly $100 trillion. A single tiny gram of this dark material, roughly the exact weight of a completely harmless ordinary paperclip, is literally worth vastly more than half of absolutely everything aggressively produced, heavily sold, and wildly traded by the entire human race in a full calendar year. This crushing, insurmountable economic reality is the single absolute greatest physical barrier standing massively between us and the bright sci-fi future of fast warp drives and infinite clean energy. The fundamental reason for this astronomical planet bankrupting price tag lies entirely in the sheer brute force, horrific inefficiency of our current primitive production methods. We absolutely do not simply find dark antimatter lying around. We have to violently manufacture it entirely from scratch in the dark. And the incredibly violent process is exactly akin to desperately trying to delicately assemble a highly complex luxury Swiss watch by violently throwing a massive bag of metal gears at a solid brick wall and desperately hoping they randomly fall perfectly into place. We are violently burning through the accumulated wealth of entire human nations just to catch a single fleeting ghost in a microscopic jar. At CERN, these elusive antiprotons are violently created by firing a massive high-energy beam of normal protons directly into a heavy, dense metal target, usually forged from solid iridium or heavy tungsten. These orchestrated, microscopic collisions are incredibly terrifyingly violent. We are forcefully accelerating normal matter to a fraction of a percent of the absolute speed of light and brutally smashing it into a solid wall. The immediate result is a chaotic, screaming spray of subatomic debris violently exploding in every possible direction. Amidst billions upon billions of utterly useless normal collisions, only a tiny microscopic handful of dark antiprotons are miraculously produced in the blinding heat. It is a terrifying process of extreme brutal attrition. For every single million protons we violently fire into the dark, we might successfully agonizingly harvest only one or two usable antiprotons. This agonizing reality directly leads us to the terrifying efficiency paradox that plagues the entire field of quantum physics. In popular optimistic culture, antimatter is almost always seamlessly depicted as the ultimate limitless fuel source. But in the cold, hard present day of human engineering, it is actually the most brutally inefficient energy storage device ever conceived by the human mind. To successfully create that single, highly dangerous gram of antimatter, we would absolutely need to run the massive Large Hadron Collider and its entire sprawling infrastructure constantly for millions of agonizing years. The sheer crushing electricity bill alone would instantly bankrupt every single developed nation on Earth. Currently in the year 2026, it violently takes about 1 billion times vastly more raw energy to painstakingly create a single antiproton than that tiny antiproton will ever possibly release when it violently annihilates in the dark. We are essentially desperately spending a massive burning mountain of dirty coal just to artificially create a single microscopic spark. From a purely cold economic standpoint, this devastating ratio makes dark antimatter a completely terrible, ruinous investment for standard human energy production. It is a highly volatile battery that brutally loses 99.999% of its initial charge the exact terrifying moment you attempt to fill it. Furthermore, the massive sprawling infrastructure required to simply support this microscopic production is some of the most insanely complex and ruinously expensive heavy machinery ever built by human hands. The massive antiproton decelerator buried at CERN is a sprawling high-tech subterranean factory that absolutely requires a small, highly trained army of world-class physicists, brilliant engineers, and exhausted technicians to safely operate. The crushing daily maintenance costs the massive cryogenic cooling systems, pumping oceans of liquid helium, and the screaming vacuum pumps that must violently run 24 hours a day absolutely add massive layers of financial overhead that permanently ensure the dark price tag remains firmly in the multi-trillions. We are absolutely not just paying for the tiny dark atoms. We are heavily paying for the massive 27-kilometer ring of humming superconducting magnets and the decades of desperate failed research that finally made them miraculously possible. Until we somehow find a miraculous way to completely skip the violent collision phase and peacefully manufacture antimatter directly out of the vacuum, it will forever remain the most ruinously expensive substance in the bloody history of our entire species. This massive, crushing economic bottleneck almost always leads directly to a highly common, desperate question from optimistic dreamers. If it is so impossibly hard and ruinously expensive to successfully make on Earth, why do we not just confidently go out into the dark void and simply harvest it? The universe is incredibly mind-numbingly vast, and surely there must be massive swirling clouds of dark antimatter silently floating in the deep void, just waiting to be harvested by brave human miners. This is exactly where we must aggressively, brutally debunk the massive, persistent myth of scooping antimatter directly from outer space. While it is undeniably true that highly energetic cosmic rays and massive violent high-energy events in deep space do randomly create tiny microscopic amounts of scattered antimatter, there are absolutely no hidden antiplanets or silent antimoons hiding anywhere in our local galactic neighborhood. If there were massive bodies of dark antimatter floating out there, the invisible violent boundary where the normal solar wind furiously meets the dark antimatter body would be an inescapable source of constant blinding gamma radiation. The entire night sky would be violently glowing with the searing light of perpetual screaming annihilation. Because our universe is remarkably terrifyingly quiet in the lethal gamma ray spectrum, we can confidently conclude with absolute certainty that dark antimatter is exactly as incredibly rare in the deep vacuum of space as it is down here on Earth. There have been highly ambitious theoretical proposals to aggressively mine the massive Van Allen radiation belts silently trapped around the Earth, which are known to briefly trap a tiny microscopic number of fast positrons and stray antiprotons violently produced by cosmic ray collisions with our upper atmosphere. In wild theory, a massive heavily shielded satellite equipped with a sprawling, humming magnetic scoop could slowly orbit the Earth and desperately gather these terrified particles over years of deep time. However, the exact density of these trapped dark particles is so laughably, pathetically low that the astronomical cost of designing, building, violently launching, and maintaining such a massive satellite would completely, utterly exceed the total financial value of the tiny amount of antimatter successfully collected. You would be desperately spending billions of human dollars just to painstakingly harvest a few microscopic picograms of volatile material. It would be exactly like desperately trying to pay off a massive crippling mortgage by slowly painfully picking up single lost pennies buried deep in a vast, scorching desert. The massive cost of the rocket fuel just to launch your ship to the edge of the desert would vastly cost more than the few pennies you might miraculously find in the sand. The cold, brutal economic reality of 2026 is that we are absolutely still stuck in the primitive, highly inefficient, pre-industrial phase of the dark antimatter age. We are exactly like the desperate, obsessed early alchemists who could miraculously create a tiny gleaming flake of pure gold from cheap lead, but tragically spent a massive fortune in toxic mercury and burning coal to actually achieve it. The historic reality-breaking breakthrough at the Alpha experiment, while scientifically massive and paradigm-shifting, absolutely does not immediately miraculously change the exorbitant price of the dark material. What it does, however, is violently move the heavy needle on the actual practical utility side of the complex equation. By miraculously trapping 15,000 volatile atoms and violently cooling them 8 times incredibly faster, we are aggressively making our massive financial investment in that dark energy vastly more durable and highly stable. If we can confidently hold the terrifying atoms vastly longer and deeply study them vastly more effectively without losing them to annihilation, the practical scientific value of every single trapped atom exponentially increases. We are finally wringing vastly more hard science out of every single spent dollar. To finally aggressively move toward a true functioning antimatter economy, we would absolutely need a fundamental mind-bending shift in exactly how we view global energy. Currently, we blindly view dark antimatter entirely as a magical fuel meant to be aggressively burned in a furnace. In the distant, highly advanced future, it might be viewed entirely as a flawless, incredibly dense medium for deep space transport. If we ever miraculously develop the complex technology to efficiently produce it at massive industrial scale, the astronomical cost would inevitably drop, but it would definitely still never be considered cheap or widely accessible. It will absolutely always be the ultimate high-octane luxury fuel completely reserved for the extreme daring elite strictly meant for highly ambitious deep space missions where every single microscopic kilogram of heavyweight desperately matters. In the cold, unforgiving vacuum of interstellar space travel, the brutal economics radically shift. If it strictly costs tens of thousands of dollars just to violently launch a single heavy liter of drinking water into low Earth orbit, then a miraculous glowing fuel that is literally a billion times vastly more energy dense than highly explosive chemical rockets suddenly starts to look like an absolute undeniable bargain, even if the initial production cost remains astronomically high. Ultimately, the staggering $62.5 trillion price tag is nothing more than a stark, brutal reflection of our own current primitive human limitations. It is a highly accurate, deeply depressing measurement of our desperate, agonizing struggle to truly master the most fundamental violent symmetry of the entire cosmos. We are currently painfully paying the ultimate ignorance tax, the incredibly high crippling price of actively doing something we do not completely fully understand just yet. As highly ambitious experiments like Alpha relentlessly continue to violently break new global records, and as our deep, terrified understanding of the dark mirror universe slowly matures, the raw efficiency will inevitably aggressively climb. But for right now, in this exact historical moment, we must humbly accept the terrifying fact that we are actively playing with the absolute most expensive, highly dangerous toys in all of human existence. Every single time the massive high-energy beam violently fires in the dark depths of CERN, we are literally burning through a massive human fortune just to desperately catch a fleeting, screaming ghost in a magnetic jar. It is a breathtaking testament to insatiable human curiosity that we are stubbornly willing to pay such an absurd, crushing price. But it is also a dark, lingering reminder that the ultimate fabled key to infinite cosmic energy is currently tightly locked behind a massive, impenetrable vault that literally costs the entire wealth of the world to just crack open. To finally answer the burning clickbait question that serves as the beating heart of this entire deeply terrifying exploration, whether the brilliant minds at CERN have finally discovered the miraculous key to infinite energy, we must aggressively reconcile a staggering mind-bending mathematical truth with a highly sobering, cold physical reality. In the bizarre, highly mathematical realm of theoretical physics, the absolute promise of dark antimatter is absolutely nothing short of pure, terrifyingly divine. It boldly represents the absolute impenetrable ceiling of physical energy density allowed by the rigid, unforgiving laws of nature. If we strictly blindly look at the raw numbers, dark antimatter is the absolute, undisputed, ultimate holy grail of existence, because the violent reaction between normal matter and its dark mirror twin is exactly, flawlessly, 100% efficient. The staggering amount of raw, screaming power, tightly locked within a microscopic, barely visible amount of this dark substance, is deeply, profoundly difficult for the fragile human mind to truly grasp. A single solitary gram of pure antimatter, through the incredibly violent process of total flawless annihilation, would instantaneously release approximately 90 trillion screaming joules of pure, searing energy. To violently drag that incomprehensible number down into a far more visceral, terrifying human context, one single gram of dark antimatter, violently reacting with exactly 1 gram of normal matter, would instantly, violently produce a catastrophic explosion equivalent to roughly 43 massive kilotons of high-explosive TNT. That is nearly 3 times the absolute city-leveling destructive power of the terrifying atomic bomb that tragically erased Hiroshima from the map. From a highly optimistic, peaceful civilian perspective, that exact same tiny single gram could theoretically seamlessly provide enough pure, clean electricity to effortlessly power a massive, sprawling global metropolis like New York City or dense London for an entire, uninterrupted day. It is undeniably the absolute most highly concentrated, tightly packed form of physical energy storage theoretically possible in the entire known expanding universe. A literal, terrifyingly condensed version of the searing, violent power of the burning stars forcefully held in the palm of your fragile hand. However, the massive conceptual leap from this beautiful theoretical potential to the utopian sci-fi concept of infinite free energy for the starving masses is currently completely blocked by a fundamental, widespread public misunderstanding of what dark antimatter actually physically is in our current primitive technological context. In the wild, overly optimistic popular imagination, we incredibly often think of dark antimatter exactly as a primary extractable fuel source, something we can luckily discover buried deep underground, aggressively mined from asteroids, or easily harvest like thick oil, black coal, or heavy radioactive uranium. We foolishly imagine boldly finding massive glowing antimatter deposits hiding in deep space that will miraculously, instantly solve our escalating global energy crisis forever. But the cold, dark reality is vastly, terrifyingly more restrictive because our entire sprawling universe is made almost completely entirely of regular, normal matter. There is absolutely no naturally occurring, free-floating dark antimatter waiting out there for us to simply go out and cheerfully collect in a bucket. Instead of miraculously mining it from the stars, every single terrifying anti-atom must be manually, painfully manufactured by us one by one in massive, incredibly expensive particle accelerators. This stark realization directly leads us to the single most important, deeply sobering reality check in all of modern quantum physics. Antimatter is absolutely not a miraculous fuel source. It is an incredibly inefficient, highly explosive battery. This absolute distinction is incredibly crucial to truly understanding exactly why we have not magically solved the world's desperate energy problems, yet despite the historic record-breaking 2026 alpha experimental results. To successfully create dark antimatter, we have to forcefully pump an absolutely incredible mind-bending amount of raw energy directly into a closed system, aggressively using massive amounts of electricity siphoned directly from the national power grids of France and Switzerland to violently accelerate normal protons to near light speeds and brutally smashing them into dense metal targets. The fundamental laws of thermodynamics are notoriously brutally unforgiving right here. According to the absolute law of conservation of energy, you can absolutely never ever get vastly more energy out of a closed system than you forcefully put into it. In absolute fact, entirely due to the extreme inherent inefficiencies of our current primitive human production methods, we are aggressively putting in billions of times vastly more energy than we could ever possibly hope to get back. We are essentially desperately spending the entire massive energy output of a sprawling heavy power plant just to painstakingly create the exact energy equivalent of a single flickering matchstick. Unless we somehow magically find a way to harvest antimatter directly from the freezing vacuum of deep space, or discover a naturally occurring ancient source miraculously left over from the violent dawn of the early universe, it will absolutely always be a massive net loss energy medium for our planet. It is an incredibly fascinating, deeply terrifying way to securely store energy in an incredibly dense, tight form, but it is absolutely not a miraculous way to generate new free energy for a desperately hungry, dying planet. This sobering realization very often brings a deep lingering sense of bitter disappointment to those millions of people raised on the bright utopian dreams of Star Trek and the highly optimistic soaring futurism of the late 20th century. In the highly idealized Star Trek universe, the massive USS Enterprise is flawlessly powered by a magical matter antimatter reaction assembly commonly known as a glowing warp core. This fictional highly advanced technology seamlessly uses dark antimatter as the primary limitless energy source to forcefully create a massive warp bubble, effortlessly allowing the massive ship to seamlessly travel vastly faster than the speed of light. In that beautiful fictional narrative, dark antimatter is exactly the cheap gasoline constantly flowing in the tank that keeps the entire utopian federation flawlessly running. But even in the wildest science fiction, the imaginative writers almost always completely glossed over the highly problematic how to actually make it part of the equation. The brutal difference is that in fiction, the crushing efficiency of massive creation and the absolute stability of safe storage are casually assumed to be fully, effortlessly solved problems. In our cold, hard, real-world year of 2026, we're absolutely still standing at the very primitive beginning of that terrifying, highly dangerous journey into the dark. We have miraculously proven we can painfully make a microscopic drop of the explosive gas, and we have triumphantly proven we can build a highly magnetic tank that securely holds exactly 15,000 terrified atoms. But we are absolutely still paying a massive crushing fortune for every single microscopic drop. I thought the end of the energy crisis was exactly what CERN was promising us, but the horrifying truth is that they are quietly building something entirely different. Among the many ancient, enduring legends of human science, absolutely few are as deeply iconic or universally understood as the simple, peaceful image of Sir Isaac Newton, sitting quietly beneath a sprawling apple tree, closely watching a piece of ripe fruit effortlessly tumble to the ground, and suddenly realizing that the exact same invisible force violently pulling that tiny apple also relentlessly governs the massive motion of the distant moon. It is the brilliant, beautiful birth of our modern understanding of universal gravity, a relentless, inescapable crushing pull that aggressively affects absolutely everything made of normal matter. But for nearly an entire agonizing century, a dark, silent, nagging question has heavily occupied the back of every single theoretical physicist's mind like a terrifying parasite. What exactly would happen if that falling apple were suddenly made entirely of dark antimatter? If a mirrored Newton had been sitting quietly under a dark tree in a terrifying mirror universe, would the heavy anti-apple still violently hit him on the head, or would it completely shockingly defy every single human intuition we have ever possessed and violently fall upward, drifting away forever into the freezing clouds? This is absolutely not just a whimsical, harmless thought experiment or a convenient, lazy plot point for a cheap science fiction novel. It is a fundamental reality-breaking test of the very fabric of space and time itself. To finally answer it, the exhausted researchers at CERN painstakingly developed the massive towering Alpha G experiment, and the terrifying results from this vertical, high-stakes quest have finally provided humanity with a definitive, chilling look at the actual weight of the mirror world. The driving motivation for this incredibly dangerous experiment lies entirely buried in the absolute bedrock of modern physics, Albert Einstein's monumental theory of general relativity. The brilliant Einstein boldly proposed that gravity is absolutely not a traditional invisible force, pulling things together like simple electromagnetism, but rather a violent physical curvature of space-time itself. Imagine placing a massive, incredibly heavy bowling ball right in the dead center of a taut, flat trampoline. The flexible fabric violently stretches and deeply curves downward under the massive weight. Anything else you carefully place on that distorted trampoline, whether it is a tiny glass marble, a light bird feather, or a single grain of sand, will inevitably relentlessly roll directly toward the heavy bowling ball entirely because of the physical shape of the curved fabric. In Einstein's terrifying, brilliant view, the invisible void of space-time is exactly that curved trampoline. According to his strict weak equivalence principle, the exact specific way any physical object rapidly falls should depend absolutely only on its initial position and its starting velocity, and absolutely not on what bizarre material it is actually made of. The cold fabric of space-time should absolutely not care if you are a normal proton or a dark antiproton, a breathing human being, or a terrifying cosmic ghost. If you possess physical mass, you must blindly, violently follow the curve. However, until very recently, this was a massive, terrifyingly unproven assumption when it strictly came to the dark, highly explosive side of the subatomic particle zoo. The deep, lingering doubt fiercely persisted because antimatter is so fundamentally perfectly opposite in absolutely every other measurable category. It possesses the exact opposite electrical charge, the exact opposite magnetic moment, and the exact opposite internal quantum numbers. Some rogue, brilliant theorists loudly argued that perhaps this perfect, unyielding opposition logically extended directly to universal gravity. If dark antimatter actually possessed what we might hesitantly call negative gravitational mass, it would be violently, aggressively repelled by the massive bulk of the Earth. This theoretical anti-gravity would have been an absolutely revolutionary, earth-shattering discovery, effortlessly offering an immediate, beautifully elegant solution to the deepest, darkest mystery of why the infant universe did not completely violently annihilate itself mere seconds after the Big Bang. If normal matter and dark antimatter actively repelled each other, They would have naturally violently drifted apart into completely separate, segregated regions of deep space, permanently preventing the great cosmic suicide and perfectly explaining exactly why we tragically do not see massive antimatter galaxies burning in the night sky today. But hard science absolutely does not thrive on beautiful, elegant bedtime stories. It relentlessly, brutally thrives on cold, hard, empirical data. To aggressively get that terrifying data, the exhausted Alpha team had to miraculously build what is essentially the world's most incredibly sophisticated, highly dangerous drop tower. This is the massive Alpha G apparatus, a towering, terrifying vertical vacuum chamber that stands in stark, imposing contrast to the massive, sprawling horizontal accelerators usually seen buried at CERN. The monumental engineering challenge of this specific vertical experiment is almost entirely beyond human comprehension. Gravity is an incredibly laughably weak force at the microscopic atomic scale. To a single terrified atom of antihydrogen, the ambient electrical and stray magnetic forces violently radiating from the surrounding human equipment are literally billions of times vastly stronger than the gentle, relentless pull of the entire mass of Earth. Desperately trying to carefully measure the microscopic effect of gravity on a terrified anti-atom is exactly like desperately trying to hear the tiny sound of a single fragile metal pin dropping onto the floor in the absolute dead center of a screaming, deafening heavy metal concert. If there is even a tiny microscopic stray magnetic field, perhaps leaking from a single piece of unshielded copper wire, or even a passing delivery vehicle on the road far outside the facility, it will violently yank the terrified anti-atom around in the dark with a massive force that completely, utterly masks the tiny, gentle tug of gravity. The terrifying experiment violently begins by successfully trapping a massive glowing cloud of these elusive explosive anti-hydrogen atoms, aggressively using the exact same shallow magnetic bathtub technology we have previously explored. But instead of just safely holding them completely still in the dark, the Alpha G machine must bravely, terrifyingly release them into the void. The exhausted scientists meticulously, flawlessly balance the powerful magnetic fields at the exact top and the exact bottom of the towering vertical chamber, violently creating a perfectly flawlessly level magnetic floor and an invisible magnetic ceiling. Once the terrified atoms are aggressively, violently cooled to within a microscopic fraction of a single degree of absolute zero, successfully minimizing their random chaotic thermal wiggling, the massive invisible magnetic gates are slowly, agonizingly lowered. The terrified researchers then hold their breath and closely watch with massive high-precision detectors to see exactly where the newly freed ghosts decide to go. Do they mysteriously leak out through the very top, defying all known laws of physics? Or do they violently tumble out through the dark bottom to their immediate deaths? This is the ultimate high-stakes game of cosmic statistics played strictly with the highly explosive ghosts of the early universe. In late 2025, and continuing throughout the agonizing months of 2026, the terrifying results of this vertical dark release were meticulously, obsessively analyzed by the world's greatest minds. The terrifying question was incredibly simple. Would the dark mirror stay flawlessly true to Einstein, or would it violently, radically break the fundamental rules of reality? The crushing data finally revealed a completely clear and unmistakably terrifying pattern. When the invisible magnetic gates were finally thrown completely open, the terrified anti-hydrogen atoms absolutely did not drift upward into the sky. They did not magically float toward the cold ceiling of the subterranean laboratory. Instead, they violently fell. They violently tumbled straight down toward the dark bottom of the massive apparatus, perfectly obeying the exact same 9.8 meters per second squared violent acceleration that relentlessly governs absolutely every single falling physical object on our entire planet. For the very first time in human history, humanity has directly witnessed dark antimatter physically falling down. The monumental significance of this chilling result is twofold. First, it is a staggering monumental confirmation of general relativity. Einstein's brilliant century-old theory has miraculously survived yet another highly advanced, desperate attempt to violently break it, definitively proving that even the most exotic, highly explosive, and volatile substance we can possibly create is still hopelessly, completely subject to the fundamental geometry of space-time. It loudly tells us that universal gravity is indeed a truly universal property, a common inescapable language spoken by both normal matter and its dark, highly explosive mirror twin. The weak equivalence principle holds incredibly firm. Space-time is exactly the same inescapable trampoline for absolutely everyone, regardless of their electrical charge or their explosive potential. However, for many hopeful physicists in the global scientific community, the definitive result is also a bit of a tragically beautiful disappointment. If dark antimatter had miraculously impossibly fallen up, we would have instantly had a completely new world-changing physics explosion. It would have violently upended our entire comfortable understanding of the universe and beautifully provided a magic bullet answer to the terrifying antimatter asymmetry problem that haunts our existence. By stubbornly falling straight down, antimatter has essentially told us to our faces that the terrifying mystery of our very existence absolutely remains unsolved. We absolutely still do not know exactly why normal matter miraculously won the ancient war at the very beginning of time, because we can no longer blindly blame it on a convenient gravitational repulsion that theoretically kept the two violent sides apart. The dark mirror is vastly more perfect and flawless than we ever hoped, which makes the tiny hidden flaw that miraculously allowed us to survive the apocalypse even vastly harder to find. But we must absolutely not overlook the historic, monumental triumph of the terrifying measurement itself. To successfully hold 15,000 screaming anti-atoms perfectly still enough and heavily shield them well enough to clearly see the tiny gentle tug of the Earth's gravity is an absolute pinnacle of human engineering and sheer stubborn willpower. It is the ultimate reality-breaking gravity test. It definitively proves that humanity has violently reached a terrifying level of absolute mastery over the hidden dark sector, where we can finally begin to aggressively treat these explosive particles not just as fleeting deadly anomalies, but as stable, reliable test subjects for the absolute most fundamental, unbreakable laws of nature. We are absolutely no longer just helplessly asking, what is it? We are aggressively asking exactly how does it behave in our reality? This definitive result also violently closes the heavy steel door on most optimistic sci-fi anti-gravity propulsion theories that heavily relied on the beautiful idea of dark antimatter being naturally magically repelled by massive planets. If we ever somehow build a functioning warp drive or a massive antimatter-powered interstellar ship, we definitely will not be effortlessly falling away from the Earth. We will absolutely be violently using the sheer screaming energy of total annihilation to brutally push against the invisible curve of space-time. The terrifying gravity test has securely anchored our wildest sci-fi dreams firmly in cold, hard, real-world physics. It loudly tells us that while dark antimatter is undeniably the ultimate most powerful fuel in existence, it absolutely still has to aggressively play by the strict rules of the cosmic house. As the massive Alpha G experiment relentlessly continues to refine its measurements desperately, looking for even vastly smaller deviations, perhaps a tiny fraction of a percent difference in the exact rate of fall, we are violently entering an entirely new terrifying phase of high-precision cosmology. We are obsessively checking the microscopic fine print of Einstein's legendary work. We have undeniably confirmed that the dark anti-apple falls straight down. But does it brutally fall at exactly the identical speed? Is there a deeply hidden, invisible fifth force of nature that silently acts slightly differently on the highly explosive mirror sector? These are exactly the terrifying, reality-breaking questions that will aggressively occupy the next bloody decade of physics research. For right now, we can confidently say with absolute certainty that the dark mirror world is absolutely not a magical place of inverted gravity. It is a highly dangerous place where the exact same invisible hands that relentlessly guide the massive planets also violently guide the terrifying ghosts. We have looked deeply into the dark abyss and found that it rigidly follows the exact same path as the light. General relativity remains the absolute undisputed king of the vast cosmos, and the dark mirror world, for all its strange beauty and terrifying destructive power, is absolutely still a part of the exact same deeply curved universe that we dangerously call home. We have seen the anti-apple fall, and in its violent descent, we have terrifyingly found a vastly deeper connection to the deadly symmetry of our ancient origins. The terrifying journey deeply into the mirror universe, which violently began as a chaotic series of flickering shadows and fleeting deadly detections, has finally reached a definitive world-altering turning point. As we rapidly move through the remainder of 2026, we must absolutely be brutally honest about exactly where we currently stand. We have absolutely not solved the massive looming global energy crisis. We are absolutely not yet blindly plugging our sprawling dying cities into massive glowing antimatter reactors, nor are we casually fueling massive starships for a quick weekend trip to Proxima Centauri. The massive dirty power plants of our polluted world will stubbornly continue to run on wind sun and traditional highly dangerous nuclear fission for the completely foreseeable future. However, what has miraculously happened within the thick concrete walls of CERN's underground alpha experiment is something perhaps even vastly more profound than a simple new power source. We have aggressively, violently tamed the wildest, most dangerously volatile substance in the entire known universe. We have aggressively taken the fabled God element, a terrifying substance that was once nothing more than a purely mathematical ghost, and forcefully turned it into a highly manageable, stable laboratory material. We have violently transitioned from the dark era of accidental lucky discovery to the terrifying era of absolute unyielding human mastery. For decades, dark antimatter was undeniably the ultimate forbidden fruit of quantum physics. It was the terrifying substance that nature violently seemed absolutely determined to keep entirely away from us, instantly vanishing the exact microscopic instant it dared to touch our reality. To desperately study it was exactly like trying to aggressively chase an invisible ghost through a pitch-black room equipped with nothing but a broken strobe light. But the incredibly recent mind-bending record of 15,000 dark atoms held perfectly stable and aggressively cooled 8 times faster than ever before brilliantly represents the forceful construction of a massive permanent sanctuary for that terrified ghost. We have miraculously, violently built a cold hearth for the absolutely most dangerous destructive fire in all of existence. This is the exact same monumental evolutionary leap that primitive early humans violently took when they miraculously moved from helplessly fearing the devastating lightning strike forest fires to proudly carrying a glowing burning ember safely inside a hollowed-out animal horn. We have violently successfully captured the absolute spark of the Big Bang, and we are finally miraculously learning exactly how to keep it from violently going out. As we boldly, terrifyingly look toward the very next decade, the technological roadmap for this highly dangerous technology is violently shifting from static frozen observation to highly dynamic massive transport. One of the absolutely most ambitious reality-breaking projects currently rapidly emerging from this historic breakthrough is the terrifying concept of the portable, highly unstable antimatter trap. Historically, if you desperately wanted to deeply study antimatter, you absolutely had to travel to Geneva. You had to expensively bring your entire massive laboratory to the base of the humming antiproton decelerator. But with the completely new mind-bending levels of deep stability and aggressive cooling efficiency we have successfully achieved, we are violently entering the unprecedented era of dark antimatter on the move. Brilliant scientists are currently already aggressively designing massive, heavily shielded traps that can be highly securely loaded onto specialized armored vehicles, dangerously moving the captured mirror universe completely across the sprawling CERN complex, or even terrifyingly transporting it across international borders to other highly secure research facilities. This is the absolute terrifying industrialization of the impossible. Once we can effortlessly move raw antimatter as casually and easily as we currently move cold liquid nitrogen, the frantic pace of scientific discovery will absolutely accelerate exponentially into the terrifying unknown. We will be entirely able to violently use these captured anti-atoms as incredibly high-precision probes in advanced material, science, experimental medicine, and massive deep space communications arrays. The next 10 agonizing years will highly likely see the highly dangerous creation of the very first massive high-density storage prototypes. While capturing 15,000 atoms is an undeniably monumental historic achievement, the absolute next terrifying goal is the staggering 1 billion atom threshold. At that massive, terrifying scale, we completely stop talking about tiny individual particles, and we violently start talking about raw bulk antimatter. This is exactly where the quantum physics gets truly terrifyingly exotic. We may very soon see the unprecedented, highly dangerous creation of dark antimolecules or even massive glowing anticrystals. We will be fully able to meticulously observe exactly how these highly explosive dark substances aggressively interact directly with each other without the constant, deadly interference of normal everyday matter. This is absolutely not just about raw explosive energy. It is entirely about aggressively, violently expanding the entire periodic table of elements into a second completely mirrored, highly explosive dark dimension. We are actively, aggressively building the terrifying foundation for a completely new alien chemistry, an anti-chemistry that flawlessly follows the exact same rigid rules, but violently uses a completely different, highly explosive set of dark building blocks. In the incredibly ambitious realm of deep space exploration, the monumental breakthrough in rapid cooling and stable storage is undeniably the very first true heartbeat of the interstellar human age. We have long known with absolute certainty that highly explosive chemical rockets are vastly too weak, and massive nuclear thermal rockets are vastly too incredibly heavy to ever take fragile humans beyond the outer edge of our solar system. Antimatter is absolutely the only known fuel with the sheer crushing energy density required to safely bridge the massive freezing gap between the distant stars. By definitively proving that we can aggressively cool highly volatile antihydrogen 8 times faster and safely hold it in an invisible magnetic cage that flawlessly obeys the rigid laws of universal gravity, we have forcefully cleared the absolute most significant, terrifying technical hurdle for future highly advanced interstellar propulsion systems. We are absolutely no longer desperately asking if we can safely store the highly explosive fuel. We are now aggressively, arrogantly asking exactly how massive we can build a containment tank. The ignorant children being born today may actually grow up in a highly advanced world where the very first massive antimatter catalyzed rockets are dangerously undergoing live testing, violently turning the freezing deep space void into a completely navigable high-speed highway. This terrifying absolute mastery also rapidly brings us vastly closer to finally solving the ultimate existential question of our violent origins. By forcing the dark mirror universe to stand perfectly still enough to aggressively examine its every microscopic detail, we are obsessively looking for the tiny microscopic flaw, the deeply hidden cosmic asymmetry that miraculously allowed us to exist in the first place. We are absolutely no longer just helplessly observing the expanding universe's most violently volatile secret. We are violently interrogating it. Every single agonizing second that those 15,000 captured atoms remarkably remain safely suspended in their humming magnetic cradle is a terrifying second where we are actively winning the ancient war against total annihilation. We are violently forcing the vast universe to finally reveal the deeply hidden crack in its supposedly perfect symmetry. It is incredibly easy to get completely lost in the massive crushing numbers, the trillions of burning dollars, the thousands of trapped atoms, the millions of freezing degrees. But the absolute true terrifying significance of the 2026 Alpha record is fundamentally human. It is a breathtaking, terrifying testament to our sheer stubborn refusal to be quietly sidelined by the vast, freezing, cold indifference of the endless cosmos. We miraculously live in a universe made almost entirely of normal matter. And for a very long, ignorant time, we were completely content to blindly assume that was the absolute only story to be told. But our insatiable, dangerous human curiosity fiercely drove us to desperately look into the dark for the other hidden half. It violently drove us to painfully build massive, sprawling machines that can successfully recreate the terrifying first moments of cosmic time and complex, invisible traps that can successfully hold the absolute most destructive substance ever conceived. We have forcefully taken the ultimate universal solvent, the terrifying substance that absolutely should instantly destroy everything it lightly touches, and we have brutally made it sit perfectly silently still. We have absolutely mastered the elusive God element, not by violently overpowering it with vastly more energy, but by deeply understanding it with terrifying precision. As we finally close this deep investigation into the dark, highly explosive side of the subterranean laboratory, we must absolutely realize that the invisible wall between our comfortable reality and the hidden dark sector has never, ever been thinner. The ultimate key to infinite cosmic energy might absolutely still be a few agonizing generations away, but the heavy steel door is finally violently unlocked. We are absolutely no longer mere guests safely hiding in a vast universe we absolutely do not understand. We are rapidly, dangerously becoming the absolute architects of a completely new reality that seamlessly includes both the blinding light and the explosive dark. The dark mirror has been violently caught. The explosive ghost has been securely caged, and the terrifying future of humanity is currently glowing fiercely with the blinding light of 1,000 annihilations. The primitive era of wondering what if is finally completely over. We are now violently standing in the terrifying era of what happens next. Whether we bravely use this terrifying massive power to finally reach the distant stars, or to finally truly understand the very first violently explosive second of our miraculous existence, the historic 2026 record at CERN has permanently ensured that we are now the absolute masters of the most powerful destructive force in nature. We have violently found the key. Now we just have to blindly decide exactly which heavy, dangerous doors we are actually brave enough to kick open.